Hey, welcome to Gold Scratch again. If you've been following my 307 project since the last video, I did receive the 15 thou thick steel head gaskets and installed them. So I got the heads on, as you can see, and intake manifolds on, and we're getting close. Just had other things to do. What's next? I've got to prime the oil system, set the valves, set the timing, put it on the engine run stand, and in a day or so we'll have it running and we'll make a video of that. So the reason for this video is to talk about dynamic compression, and it came up in my as a subject because it's something that I do pay a lot of attention to because it's very important, and it's something that probably is worth a little explanation. So there's two types of compression: dynamic and static compression. So going back to the point of waiting for the valve or for the steel head gaskets, the 15 thou thick steel head gaskets compared to the standard head gasket, which are 40 thou, will improve the compression ratio, the static compression ratio of this engine from about 9.1 to 9.6, and that's a lot. It's very valuable. So there's three ways to improve the performance of an engine: increasing the compression, increasing the valve timing, and increasing the flow of combustible mixture through the intake manifold, through the intake and exhaust ports, and out the headers. And of the three, compression is probably the most single important because compression helps you everywhere. If you improve your compression ratio, your dynamic and your static compression ratio, and your measured compression in the cylinder, which we'll talk about, then you will improve horsepower and torque everywhere. If you improve high-end RPM performance by a big camshaft with long duration and big lift, you will gain at the top end, but it's a compromise. You will lose at the low end. If you improve by putting large valves and large heads and bigger headers and all that stuff, once again, you will improve your performance at the top end, but you will probably sacrifice a little bit of bottom end power. So dynamic and static compression are important, and that's why we pay attention to it. So when we say 9.6 to 1 static compression, it's pretty simple. It's the volume of the total combustion chamber when the piston's at the bottom of the stroke, exactly at the bottom of the stroke. That includes the combustion chamber volume of the cylinder head, the volume that's taken up by the head gasket, and the volume that's taken up by the deck height, it would be a piston being down the hole, so to speak. That volume divided by the volume when the piston's at the top. So you take the swept volume away, and so if you have 10 to 1 compression ratio, for example, a static calculated 10 to 1 compression ratio, then the volume of the cylinder at the bottom will be 10 times more than the volume of the cylinder when the piston's at the top. And you can calculate that from basic principles using geometry. For the combustion chamber volume, you typically either know what it is or measure it with a burette. But the other factors you need to know your boring stroke, you need to know the thickness of your head gasket, you need to know your deck height, how far the piston is down the hole, and so on. And you can calculate your static compression ratio. However, dynamic compression takes another factor into account. Static compression assumes that as soon as the piston starts to move up the stroke, the intake valve is closed, and of course the exhaust valve is closed, and you're compressing all the mixture from the very bottom of the stroke to the very top. In fact, that doesn't actually happen. Every camshaft, and the higher the performance camshaft, the more this is going to be true. The intake valve doesn't close at the very bottom of the stroke. In fact, it takes time varying up to 75, sometimes 80 degrees before the intake valve is closed. Thus, your dynamic compression ratio is going to be, at least numerically, smaller than your static compression ratio. So, how do you calculate? That's a little trickier to calculate from basic principles in geometry. because it takes into account not only your bore and stroke, but your connecting rod lengths, how fast your piston is moving coming up, and more other geometry to calculate dynamic compression. So the easy way to do that is just go online and Google dynamic compression ratio, and if you have all the values to punch in, you can calculate your own dynamic compression ratio. So here's how it works. If you have a big cam in your engine that's where the intake valve is closing late, typically, then you need a high compression ratio. Because if you put a big cam in an engine that has low compression, you will just kill the bottom end power. On the other side, if you have a high compression engine and you put a small cam in, that won't be the problem, but you'll have detonation because you'll have too much dynamic compression. And for street use, that'll be a problem. The high lift cams actually allow you to use more compression, and more compression actually allows you to use the higher lift cam. It kind of works together. So you need to remember that, and in every case, when you're selecting a cam, it's a compromise. And so typically that's why camshafts are often made with split overlaps. In other words, the intake valve has a lower duration than the exhaust valve, because it's only the intake valve that has an effect on the dynamic compression. So typically, for example, the intake valve on this camshaft that I've selected, and I've detailed that in previous videos, the spec on the cam, etc. That valve closes at 55 degrees after bottom dead center. So picture this. The piston's at the bottom and 45 is here. It's actually pistons up more than halfway to the middle before the intake valve is actually closed. So although the piston's coming up, it's not compressing anything. It's actually pushing that mixture back out to the carburetor, and that's why cams that have a long duration have a very rough idle, because you're actually, it's called reversion. It's actually pushing the fuel mixture back out. So it's a matter of matching your camshaft with your compression ratio, which I think we've done well here. We have just over 8-to-1 dynamic compression on this engine with all the factors that I mentioned, and with that we can actually calculate what compression pressure, when you measure with a gauge, calculate what compression pressure that we'll have. We think it's going to be around 160 to 165 pounds. That assumes a perfectly sealed cylinder, and when the engine is fresh before it's broken in on the dyno, you don't have that because the rings are not broken in. So we don't expect to see perfect numbers until we come off the dyno and the engine's fully, the rings are fully, the cylinder walls and the rings are matched together, and the engine's completely, rings are completely broken in. And thus we will look for the 165 psi of cranking pressure. So a little background on this whole issue of compression and why it is where it is. So if you go back in the day, prior to 1971, or starting in 1971, the EPA mandated that all cars sold in North America must be able to run on unleaded fuel. And that was the end of an era in terms of the muscle car. It was the beginning of the decline of the muscle car area, at least, because all of a sudden all the manufacturers had to dump compression ratios. My Z28, for example, had 11-to-1 compression. The high performance 396s and 427s had 11-to-1. Some had actually had 12-to-1 right from the factory compression ratio. And those engines will not run very well on 93 octane fuel. As a result, all the manufacturers had to look for a way to get around this, and it took them more than 10 years to figure out how to make horsepower again when you were stuck with unleaded fuel. And they've done that with fuel injection, direct injection, of course computers and all that kind of stuff. And they actually make more power than ever now. But starting in 1971, gas stations had two sets of pumps. They had a set of pumps that was ethanol, and another set of pumps that was leaded fuel, and over time the leaded fuel pumps were disappeared, and you had to be able to run your car on ethanol or fuel that typically around here anyway, 93 or 94 octane that you could buy. So here's the problem with that as well. So leaded fuels were able to raise the octane level because of the lead. And back in the day, you could buy, when I was drag racing my Z28, you could buy 260 Sunoco at the pumps with 100 octane. And we were running, a lot of guys were running 12 to 1 compression on the street with pump gas back then. All of a sudden, you can only buy 94 is the best you could buy. And the way that's achieved is mixing the fuel, which is where the energy is, with ethanol, which is alcohol. And alcohol and ethanol has a lower BTU per pound or BTU per gallon, less energy, let's put it that way, in it than the fuel does. So the more ethanol you put into the fuel, the less energy you're going to have in a pound or a gallon of fuel. Thus, you should never use a higher octane than you need, because you're not only spending money for nothing, you are actually probably hurting the performance of your engine. If you don't have a high compression engine, you don't need 94 octane fuel. Personally, and I'm not advertising for Shell, but my experience has been the engine that's in my Camaro, which is a 604 crate engine out of my race car. I actually dynoed it with 91 octane Shell and 94 octane on separate dates, and it actually made more power with 91 octane Shell. 91 octane Shell claims that there is no ethanol in it whatsoever. I can't verify that, but I can tell you that that's my preferred fuel that I use in engines, unless you have such a high compression ratio that you have no choice other than to use the higher octane fuel. If you don't need it, don't use it. So this engine will run fine on 91 octane fuel. It's 9.6 compression ratio with the dynamic compression that we have. It should run fine on 91 octane, and that would be my recommendation. So I hope that's helpful in terms of dynamic versus static compression ratio. It's something that I pay a lot of attention to, and that's in the planning stages before we even start buying any parts, to make sure that we match the compression ratio, the camshaft, and all the rest of the components together to get the best outcome for the investment that we make. So I hope that's helpful. Stick with us the next couple of days. I do hope to have this 307 running. Everything I've said, by the way, applies to any engine, whether it's a 307 or a Chrysler or Ford engine or whatever. All that stuff is just physics, and it applies to all those engines. So I hope you can find a practical way to apply that and find that helpful. And we like likes and subscriptions, and so let's keep working together. And thanks for watching Gold's Garage.